Paul Dano, the actor who played the Riddler in Matt Reeves' The Batman, just gave an interview with The Independent where he talks about how quantity over quality ruined the superhero movie. Here is what he said, quote, "It's an interesting moment where everybody has to go like, okay, what now? Hopefully from that, somebody either breathes new life into comic book movies or something else blossoms which is not superheroes. I'm sure there will still be some good ones yet to come, but I think it's kind of a welcome moment. It's a larger thing too. As soon as the word content came into what we do, meaning making movies or TV, it meant quantity over quality, which I think was a big misstep. And I certainly don't need that as a viewer or as an artist," end quote. This take on the decline of the superhero movie is pretty much the normie-conformie acceptable opinion on what caused the downfall of the superhero genre. If you think that I'm going to decry Get Woke, Go Broke as the catalyst for the downfall, then you are sorely mistaken. What really killed the superhero movie was the corporatism of modern Hollywood. Now let me explain this before you go off and decry me as some communist for even uttering this opinion. In order to do that, we need to examine 4 different genres of movies. What do the Western, the space opera, the killer shark movie, and the slasher movie all have in common? No one company owned the entire genre. With the Western, it was very simple. Build a set to look like an old West town, write the script to one of the 7 Western plots according to TVTropes.com, which would be a Union Pacific story / railroad story, a ranch story, an empire story, a revenge story, a cavalry and Indian story, an outlaw story, or a martial story. Right? Throw a couple of gunfights in there for good measure, and there you go. You've got yourself a Western. According to the Hollywood Reporter, in 1927, Westerns were the second most popular genre for theater owners to rent, and in 1948, 25% of Hollywood's film output were Westerns. Every studio was getting in on the Western: 20th Century Fox, Paramount, RKO, MGM, including the Poverty Row Studios, so studios like Republic Pictures, Producers Releasing Corporation, that was shortened to PRC, and Monogram Pictures. Most of the Poverty Row Studios pretty much became defunct really quickly, but you may have heard of some of their movies like Angel and the Bad Man that was produced by Republic Pictures, the Lone Rider series with George Houston, and then eventually Bob Livingston took over the role. That was PRC, Producers Releasing Corporation. No one major company owned the Western. It was all up for grabs by everyone. After Jaws released in 1975, it spawned a slew of not just killer shark movies, but killer animal movies in general. Grizzly was basically just Jaws in the woods. Instead of a killer shark, it was a killer grizzly bear. There was also a movie called Alligator that came out in 1980 that was Jaws, but with an alligator. Important to note, alligator does not, for a fact, have 3 letters in its name.
Name an animal with 3 letters in its name.
Alligator.
Name an animal with 3 letters in its name. You said alligator. Our survey said...
There was also a movie called Orca that released in 1977 that was Jaws, but with a killer whale. The most famous Jaws ripoff, obviously, being the Roger Corman 1978 classic Piranha, directed by Joe Dante. Killer shark movies are still being made to this day by small production companies like The Asylum with Two-Headed Shark Attack, and their most famous movie of all time at this point, Sharknado. And Sharknado, in and of itself, brought back killer shark movies, at least on cable, not really theatrically. After Halloween released in 1978, that spawned a slew of slasher movies, and some of those copies of Halloween would become classics in the slasher movie genre. Prom Night, The Mutilator, The Funhouse, and the most famous Halloween clone, Friday the 13th. After Star Wars released, there were a slew of space operas that were releasing to capitalize on its popularity. Movies like The Black Hole, Star Trek the Motion Picture, along with The Wrath of Khan, Flash Gordon with Sam Jones, Star Crash, and the Roger Corman-produced Battle Beyond the Stars with Richard Thomas and George Peppard. Why did I want to talk about all of these different genres even though they really have nothing to do with each other? because no one company owned the space opera or the Western or the slasher movie. Anybody could make them. But with superhero movies, only 2 companies have a stranglehold over the entire genre. Those 2 companies would be Marvel and DC. What is different about today's film industry that what is different about today's film industry that yesterday's film industry had? There is no more Poverty Row Studios. Granted, some do exist, like Full Moon Features, that's Charles Band's company, Troma, The Asylum, but their movies don't get released to theaters. Troma movies haven't been mainstream since the late 1980s. Full Moon Features specialized in the direct-to-video market in the 90s, and Asylum did the same thing in the 2000s and 2010s. Sharknado wasn't released theatrically until last year, 2023, for a 10th anniversary screening. Sharknado released on a basic cable channel in the United States called Sci-Fi. I don't know what it released on everywhere else, but at least in the States, it was a Sci-Fi original movie. Sure, everyone was talking about Sharknado on Twitter and making memes out of the movie, but imagine if Sharknado had been released to theaters instead of direct-to-cable. It may have had an even bigger impact than it did, but because of all the corporatism in the film industry, the $100+ million movie is the only movie that got played at the box office for so long that there simply wasn't any smaller superhero movies that came out to capitalize on the popularity of the genre. There might have been movies that were made by Full Moon or Asylum, but those either went direct to cable or direct to video / direct to streaming instead of being released to theaters. Therefore, those low-budget superhero exploitation films simply won't have the same impact as something like Friday the 13th or Battle Beyond the Stars had. Disney owns Marvel, and Warner Bros. Owns DC. Troma, Full Moon Features, and The Asylum combined don't have the funds to match the level of Disney or Warner Bros.' marketing budgets. That is why the superhero genre truly died. The small, independent Poverty Row Studios couldn't capitalize on the popularity of the superhero in the 2010s like they could with Star Wars back in the late 1970s, early to mid 1980s. Correction, companies like The Asylum or Troma or Full Moon could make low-budget superhero movies, but you wouldn't have ever heard about them because they don't get released theatrically. It wasn't a quantity over quality issue, it was a duopoly issue. Another issue that plagued the superhero genre was the death of the video store. Let's create a hypothetical situation, but one that a lot of 90s and early 2000s kids will be familiar with. You and your family drive to Blockbuster, or Hollywood Video, or Family Video, or insert mom and pop video store here to go and rent Bryan Singer's X-Men. By the time you get to the video store, all of their copies of Bryan Singer's X-Men are gone. Well, you drove all the way to the video store to rent a movie. You're not heading home empty-handed. You always had a second choice movie, sometimes a third choice, and even rarer, a fourth choice movie. If those movies weren't there, but you still wanted to watch a superhero movie, then the video store might have something from a smaller studio that will fit that need. Or they might have something like The Meteor Man or Steel if you want to watch a superhero movie. Hell, they might have had a copy of The Phantom with Billy Zane and Catherine Zeta-Jones from 1996. Sure, you went into the video store looking to rent a copy of Bryan Singer's X-Men and they didn't have it. But now you've been exposed to these other superhero and pulp hero movies that you may have never been aware of, had you not gone into the video store that day. With streaming services and algorithms, unless if you know a movie exists, you're just not going to find it. Sure, there won't be an issue finding The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly because it's one of the most famous spaghetti westerns of all time. But have you ever heard of Have you ever heard of Django? How about The Great Silence? How about Kioma? How about Duck You Sucker, aka A Fistful of Dynamite? All of these spaghetti westerns that I have listed are considered top 10 best spaghetti westerns of all time. Yet, the only one that you probably have heard of is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So, let's close this video out here. What killed the superhero genre? It's simple. it was the McDonaldization / corporatization of the film industry, whatever you want to call it. McDonaldization, corporatization, same thing. Tomato, tomato, potato, potato. And the death of the video store.